people are going to realise that this government is going to literally take down the earth.
Welcome to Surviving Society's collaborative series with the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, based at the University of Manchester, also known as CODE. In these episodes, we explore the facts and evidence produced through the Centre's leading research. We ask how changing patterns of inequalities relating to the ways in which ethnic identities are perceived, acted upon and experienced in Britain. Across the series, we focus on policy and debates around ethnic diversity, integration, immigration and inequality. The Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity have produced a report on responses to the policing of the crisis of COVID-19 and the global pandemic. On this report was Patrick Williams, Remy Joseph Salisbury, Scarlett Harris and Lisa White. The issues they were looking at primarily focused on the over-policing of minoritized people and communities in the wake of the COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter protests. In the report, they explore first-hand accounts of the policed alongside family and media narratives to facilitate an urgent reprisal of police violence. They worked in collaboration with national campaigns and community groups, and their project aimed to surface the highly personalised and traumatised experience of being policed, paying particular attention to the factors that precipitate and drive up police encounters and use of force for minority ethnic people. Welcome to another episode of Surviving Society. I am really excited to be in the studio with Adam Elliot-Cooper, or Dr. Adam Elliot-Cooper, who is, I know you don't like that.
It's fine. No, it's fine.
Yeah, I'd like, what? It's because you don't. Is it because you don't like hierarchy?
I don't know. It's just a bit weird.
You don't like in what way?
I don't know. We're not really medical doctors, so I'm just out here just calling a doctor. Anyway, it just kind of reminds me of something my mum says when she's trying to show off to the aunties, isn't it? Like, it doesn't really feel.
I know, but
real.
the reason why I'm picking you on that, sorry, listeners, I do know Adam like outside of the studio, is because whenever I see people kind of project that you are a scholar or a scholar activist, you always push it back, and I'm just interested in why you do that.
Oh, do you know what? It's probably because I spend so much time on my fieldwork with like old school elder activists from the 80s.
Yeah,
who spend all their time cussing academics.
Yeah.
I just kind of like recoil a little bit when someone reminds me that I'm that guy. I'm just like, oh, sorry.
No, I hear you. So Adam is an educator on the board of the monitoring group and a lecturer at Queen Mary in social and public policy. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So we're going to be talking about today your latest book, Black Resistance to British Policing. Like, for me personally, I've known and followed your work for like 9-10 years now, I'd say. Like, you come out of your undergraduate, you go into your masters, like you move down to London and you start to sort of educate yourself as a black person on like scholarship or scholar activism or what's happening on the ground and what's happening in the university. And at the time, you were very much a prominent figure. When I was sort of, why are you laughing? It's true. And there'll be people listening to this who believe that. So when I was reading the book, it felt very familiar to read it, because it felt like watching you on TV, reading your stuff, this felt like seeing all that in book form. It was really comforting to read and, yeah, familiar, but also made me think, God, this must have been a really difficult book to write because it's deeply personal.
Yeah, I guess a lot of it was personal. But in many ways, I feel like it was difficult to write because my politics and the political world around me has changed so much in the last 10 years, right? The book started out as a PhD, which is completely different to the book that it eventually became. And I think it kind of changed for the better. I mean, when I first started the PhD, people say, oh, what you're researching? I say, I'm looking at how black communities are organising to defend themselves from the police. And they would often look at me quite confused, and they say, in America. And I'd say, no, here in the UK. And they'd say, what? Baffled. Mm. But you know what? When I was writing the book, and I tell people what I'm writing the book about, they'd be like, oh, yeah. Mm. Oh, yeah, I saw that protest happen. Oh, I saw that thing on the news. Oh, I read an article, or I saw something on social media, or, oh, actually, my friend was involved in a thing. And the political world around me has transformed so much. Obviously, it has nothing to do with my PhD. No one read it apart from me and my examiners. But
sorry, can I just say, in 2014, I saw you present your PhD work at Birkbeck on Stuart Hall and the London riot. So actually, I do know about your PhD.
and a few undergraduate students, or master students. But yeah, so the world around me has changed a lot. So that took a lot of work to try to attempt to do some justice to how transformative the last 10 years have been in relation to black struggle against policing in this country and beyond. So there's that. But yeah, there's also me trying to make sense of the world. You know, there's a lot more kind of post-colonial feminism in the book than the PhD had. The PhD used a lot of kind of black feminism, which was a bit too American, right? And it didn't quite fit with, I think, the context in which I was writing about as well as it could have. I started thinking more about colonial policing, in a lot more detail. I started to think about abolition more and more, right? Which, I mean, is a kind of an endless well of possibilities and ideas and hopes and dreams. So the book is different, and that made it a very hard thing to do. And I guess finally, the last thing I'll say is that I really wanted to, of course, make the book. I wanted to translate it from the kind of academic language that you have to write in order to please the people examining you, and try to make it something that hopefully ordinary people would enjoy. And I remember writing the introduction and sending it to my cousins and being like, can you read this and let me know, just highlight anything that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, nice.
And so, yeah, I worked really hard to try to, hopefully make it something which other people could read as well.
Definitely. Just one of the threads that you said there about the sort of coloniality of policing, it reminded me when I was reading the book of James Trafford's book.
Yeah, I've read,
Yeah. I could see, like, it's so amazing to see those different threads or historical, like locating the historical nature of policing, the colonial nature of policing to the present, because as with all of this book, so much of this history is not known within mainstream conversations about, black diasporans, education in general. And it's like, actually, like, this is it.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I mean, it's British policing, for the most part, historically, hasn't taken place on the British mainland, right? It's taken place in Ireland, in the British Caribbean, across the African continents, parts of Asia, Australia, North America, etc., right? But because there's this geographical disjuncture, sea and land, between Britain and its colonies and former colonies, it means that Britain is able to have a bit of amnesia, right? Forget, have a conceptual disjuncture between its domestic policing and its imperial policing. And I think that, like, we have to remember that the British Parliament were making laws all over the empire. I mean, we were just, before we came on, we were talking about Sita Balani's brilliant new book, Deadly and Slick, right? Where she talks about how the British Parliament in the 18 and 1900s were debating who should have sex with whom and under which circumstances in India, in Jamaica, in Nigeria, in all of these different parts of the empire, right? This is the level of detail that they were concerned with control over across the empire. So of course policing was something which was done in Westminster and had far-reaching effects across the world.
Going to come back to that thread later, particularly about the control, but control like physically, but also the control of ideas and why this history is sometimes often omitted from mainstream education. But the thing that I wanted to sort of start with, Adam, is again, like, kind of admiration of your work and scholarship, and something that's definitely inspired my own thinking, but it's hard, it's definitely a praxis, is that your refusal to engage in deficit language around black people and your commitment to resistance is crucially about locating the fact that we have always stood up for ourselves. And I think, well, what we have sometimes found challenging, I think this is a multi-ethnic, multi-classed issue, is recognising that resistance, both historically and contemporary, in times of anguish or in times of helplessness or in times of experiencing the state, in all of its manifestations, in all of its violences. And whether I've seen you speak on TV or whether I see in writing in this book, it's like at the heart of this book, it's always about we are not victims.
100%. I mean, I think there's a couple of things, right? One of them, of course, is, and I'm sure many people in this country experience this, when they start to become interested in politics and struggle, and they want to learn about anti-racism, the market is saturated by American literature, right? Which at the start is incredibly inspiring. When people, you read Malcolm X's autobiography, you'll read Andrew Davis's autobiography, you'll read Bell Hooks, you'll read Stokely Carmichael, all this stuff. And then after a while, you realise, oh, actually, right, so how does that, I can't really just transpose that to Britain or to Europe or whatever. I need something else, right? So part of it was about me wanting to uncover, and fortunately over the last 10 years a number of books have been published by proper historians, right?
Sorry, you just deficit language in yourself. What do you mean proper historians?
Well, people who go to the archives properly, innit?
Oh yeah, I know what you mean. They love the archives, don't they?
Thank God someone does. But anyway, no, I love the archives occasionally. But yeah, so part of it was wanting to uncover that history, which I felt was neglected or underpublished, right? But also part of it was about being like, am I going to do this PhD for 3 or 4 years and just write about suffering and death? And that was doing my nut in. I just thought I need something every day. I need a purpose to wake up that isn't going to depress me. And writing about resistance enables that. And I think we all need that. I mean, we were at an event recently with Gargi, right, Bhattacharya, where she said, look, if we leave this meeting more depressed and dishevelled than when we entered it, then we're doing our enemy's job for us, right?
Yes.
And I hope that people don't leave the final pages of that book feeling like that. I hope they feel empowered, and that's one of my intentions. Writing about resistance. Definitely.
And you can see how challenging it is to have that kind of resistance spirit within us in our day-to-day lives. Like, what is clear throughout the book is the pressure of the state and capitalism makes imagining emancipatory futures or abolition so challenging. So you can see why, but the fact that you have both the energy and the spirit to keep that at the heart of your work, I think is very admirable. But as you say throughout the book, like, it's about locating that history to kind of energize our movements forwards.
Yeah. I think there's it's trying to do some kind of intellectual work, but there's definitely a political project there, right? And we need to think about, I don't know, I think drawing together the different kind of disparate forms of resistance that take place and thinking about them in a more holistic kind of way, which is one of the things I try to do.
So you did mention about kind of US history of Black resistance, and one of my questions was like, why is it that the transnational and localised history of Black resistance in Britain often gets sidelined for Black and African American resistance in the US? But then as I was thinking about that question, particularly after reading chapter 2, I was like, I think I do know the answer. Is it that it's both part of a state organised practice, but also the way of democratising knowledge has changed dramatically in the last few years? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, of course, America is the cultural hegemon of the world, and by extension, Black America is the hegemonic Black culture, hegemonic Black identity, right, to which very often all other Black identities are contrasted or compared. So I think that's obviously one important factor. But also, of course, unlike in Britain, the United States has a number of centuries of having a strong, often leftist political and intellectual class, right, in a relatively concentrated area. I mean, Black Britain does have a political and intellectual class, but it is scattered across Britain's former empire, right, and former colonies, right. So we have that literature there about anti-colonial struggles in Ghana or Trinidad or Kenya or Grenada, wherever they might be. But because of those disparate histories and geographies, it's not as coherent as the African American story in the United States of America, and I think that it makes the work of writing about it, of course, more difficult. But I think there's a strength in that complexity and that diversity that makes Black Britain what it is, and makes it that kind of messy, difficult, complicated, often contradictory set of identities. And I think it can make us stronger, partly because it necessitates an internationalism, Right? It's very difficult to be a black British nationalist because of those histories, those very recent histories of migration and constant forms of movements. We have to think beyond Britain's borders, and I think that is certainly a strength.
Definitely. Just coming back to the kind of the localised movement of black resistance, and you name a number of cases, death at the hands of the police. And one of the things that I think is really brilliant about your work that goes beyond this book that I've seen you write about in different academic papers, but also speak about, is the strength and the tenacity of black women. And I think the way you've written the book is I can also see how your writing and stuff has changed in a way that kind of is demonstrable of that kind of the black feminist thread throughout. I can see that. But also what I think is so incredible about your work is the kind of black mothers, the aunts, the sisters that you bring to the forefront. And I guess one of the things that always interests me is that why is it that history or that these women are so often often fighting in isolation?
Yeah. So for me, I don't even feel like I brought black women to the forefront of that story. I mean, when I started coming to these protests, those were the people who were at the forefront. Mm-hmm. Right? They were the people who were on the mic, telling their stories, hyping up the crowd, moving the crowd. They were the ones at the meetings. They were the ones organising. They were the ones doing all of that kind of work. And it just really stood out to me. I'd not come across a movement which was not explicitly feminist that was being led almost exclusively by women. And so when I was, doing the research, it was one of the key questions I wanted to ask everyone. Have you noticed that all of these campaigns that we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes are all led by women? Do you think, what is the significance of that? Is it a coincidence? Why is that? What is the effect of that? What can we learn from that? And what was interesting, I guess, about it is that everyone I spoke to had a different answer. No one, and there is, of course, no definitive answer, right? So some people talked about there being a long history of that goes back to slavery and women having to fight for their children during the period of chattel slavement in the Caribbean, who were often, of course, taken away from them. Others talked about how black men are policed differently because of the way in which black masculinity is essentialised as being violent and dangerous and a kind of a specific kind of threat. And so women have to take on, or are compelled to take on this kind of role. There are so many, and some people just didn't know at all. Some men had never thought about it. Not naming names. So, and so this was something which I wanted to grapple with, but I knew that I would not have a definitive answer for the reader. Right? And I feel like, and I've come across this in other conversations. People are kind of reading that chapter, that second chapter, and kind of waiting for me to kind of, and this is why women are doing that. And I'm just like, no. And I think it's important and it's good to keep it open like that. And I think there can be multiple historical, political, social, psychological, emotional reasons why women are at the forefront of these struggles. And I think the real take home for me was that we need to, therefore, this is one of the many reasons we need to think about gender as well as race and class, when we're both criticising the police, but crucially when we're trying to build alternatives to them as well.
Definitely. And I guess just on your point there, what I also found interesting, and this kind of builds from a conversation that we had on the show with Paul Gilroy, and also his writing about how campaigns in particular were unable to... I don't want to take away, obviously this whole book is like in dedication to how much organising, campaigning has been at the forefront of black resistance, but how various deaths, for example, where we have been unable to join up momentum over the past, go back to Stephen Lawrence, for example, to now. And again, I think I'm sort of saying stuff to you that I kind of know the answer to, but just sort of picking apart, why is it that we can't build momentum in that way?
I mean, if we knew how to build momentum every time, we'd be out building momentum every time, right?
Yeah.
We don't know why it was, George Floyd specifically, right? When there have been so many other deaths caught on camera, right? We don't know the exact reason why it was Stephen Lawrence and not any of the other black deaths at the hands of far right fascists, right? We don't know the specific. We can look at the constellation of forces which led to media interest and activists getting involved with the family, and all of these different things happening, and Nelson Mandela coming out of prison, right? There are all these constellation of forces that take place, but of course we know that the social world isn't a mathematical science, right? If we could create a formula for how we develop a movement and build momentum and do all those kind of things, then we'd probably be lying to ourselves, right?
Yeah. I think as well, like, just sort of on that point about like what gains traction, like in those moments, or let's say for example when George Floyd was murdered, like you're having conversations with people that don't know the history of Black death at the hands of the police, and you kind of want to say to people, yeah, but what about this person? What about that person? And like, what do you do in those what is the best thing to do in those moments? Is it best to engage where they're at in terms of, okay, let's talk about the individual case? Do you see what I mean?
Totally. I mean, I think it was Sivanandan, right, who said we need to turn cases into causes, right? And this is how a lot of the families who have lost a loved one at the hands of the police, who now, consider themselves to be activists, have entered these kind of movements, right? And this is a common story, right? People, you can talk to people who are involved in London Renters Union, right? Who are people beef their individual landlord. They realise all their neighbours are going through the same thing. They realise the whole city's going through the same thing, and then, right, it very often works upwards in that kind of way. I mean, one of the things that I noticed that a lot of the protests, both in 2014, 2015, when Ferguson and Baltimore and New York uprisings were taking place, and there are solidarity actions here in cities like London, but also later in 2020, is that activists would turn up and read out the names of the people. Who have died,
you're right. That would always happen.
And they would talk about, and they'd say, I remember one activist getting on the mic and saying, you've all heard of Eric Garner, but how many of you heard of Joy Gardner, right? Which was a nice little rhetorical flourish, right? But then he tells the story of Joy Gardner, right? Tells the story of this woman being killed by the border authorities in this country, right? And the circumstances in which she died, and the campaign that developed around it, right? So people turn up and join, and go to where people are at and build momentum, right? And I think that there's one of the big kind of the testimony to that is one of the big slogans, I think, from the 2020 protests was, the UK is not innocent, right? And I think a lot of the protesters were very clear and assertive in not allowing the media or many other people to allow this to be considered a purely US issue.
Yeah. Just on the point you made there, Adam, about Joy Gardner's killed by the police as well, when you describe that time in the book, I found it really difficult to read. It's not the first time that I've read what happened to Joy Gardner, and it won't be the last. But there is something emotionally, spiritually, practically that happens at the time when you read about Black death in this way. And we were actually at a Surviving Society listening event last week, and people were talking about what it means to listen to pain or death at the hands of the state in that way, alluding to the fact that maybe we shouldn't do it. And I don't know what I think. I don't know how I feel about it, and I don't, because it's like and I'm glad that you did it in the book, like at various points. Is this something that you thought about at time? Yeah,
of course.
It's hard, isn't it?
But my general rule is to take the lead from the family.
Yeah, and they do, and that's
right.
a good. That's it. That's the answer.
Like, how open are the family to the circumstances? How much have they publicised it? If I've been able to speak to them directly, which I often am, I can just ask them. Yeah. Right. And that's generally my approach.
That's a good approach. Okay, that's enough on that. One of the key threads, I think, in the book, which I think is so powerful, and you always, whenever I see you present, you always do this, is the connections between race, class, and capitalism and resistance. And one of the things that I feel like builds through the book, both in the Caribbean and Britain, is how, like, the protest and the infusion of trade union activism has been so central to anti-racist resistance, and kind of looking at more hopeful threads of resistance towards the end of the book. You talk about different protests at sort of Westfields and like transport, like how like disrupting capitalism has now like sort of been at the forefront of our more contemporary organising. But again, like it was always there historically as well, but it has to sort of take new forms because capitalism takes new forms. And I think that that's what's different about your scholarship in terms of how you narrate and talk about Black resistance, but also anti-racism. And I think that we need more of that. But it's difficult to do it because we are all part of the system. But I'd really admire and appreciate that constant turn back to capitalism throughout the book.
Ah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things I say towards the end were maybe a bit risky. I don't know. I was kind of just watching what was happening and kind of thinking what's going on. But of course, this has become more and more frequent, right? And with Just Stop Oil and all of these kind of environmental protests, the idea of disrupting the everyday and forcing the media to have a conversation that they wouldn't have otherwise. And the purpose of the disruption isn't for the public to have sympathy with the people protesting, but to force them to have a discussion about the topic about which they are protesting. I think is proliferating, and I think we're only going to see happening more and more often as deportations are escalated, as the climate crisis becomes more acute and pronounced and destructive, and as this becomes one of the few ways in which people can disrupt capital flows in a way that is considerably more difficult now that trade unions have been decimated in many parts of the industrial sector, or industrial labour has been, and work has been moved to more readily exploitable workforces in the global south.
Another thing that's brilliant throughout the book is you talking about the increase of criminalisation and how the combination of increase in surveillance and criminalisation is obviously creates an expansion of the prison population, but also an expansion of just a carceral culture within Britain. And I think that it's still really challenging to read back through what was happening in the 2011 riots and how easy it was for both the government and the media to frame what was happening as something that was a load of Black people being criminals, basically. And what I think is so powerful that you do is you reassert both resistance, the actual story of what happened, and as in locating the death of Mark Duggan. I think there's a lot of hope throughout the book, but sadness, why I find it difficult, is like I feel like that was kind of a conjuncture which then very much saw the increase in surveillance. And where I see a moment for political education is I don't feel like a lot of people understand how much surveillance is so integral to criminalisation now.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, so I think there's two things, right? Yeah, 2011 was a real watershed, I think. But I think people talk about it as a watershed moment in relation to state power, right? And the government having renewed, I guess, confidence and a mandate to expand prison and police power in ways that we haven't seen in a very long time. But of course, 2011 was also the year in which reggae artist Smiley Culture died at hands of police. Kingsley Burrell died in circumstances not dissimilar to George Floyd, died of asphyxiation in Birmingham, in the West Midlands. And then, of course, Mark Duggan was shot and killed by the police. And we see a massive resurgence in Black protest, popular organising, the like of which we hadn't seen since the Lawrence campaign, I would argue. So while we do have this resurgence of state power, and it brings in a lot of people, including a lot of activists and scholars that I really respected, were kind of didn't see the politics of what was taking place in these rebellions, and dismissed them, and unfavourably contrasted them to the rebellions of the 1980s, which I think was unfair. And I think, looking back, I think a lot of them might regret that. But a lot of things did change, and I think one of the big things that certainly did change was surveillance. You're completely right, and I think it's quite timely as well, right? Because it's timely because we've just come out of a load of rebellions in France, in which Macron has now confidently asserted that the rebellions took place because of poor parenting, particularly single-parent households, and lack of discipline in the home, which of course is the kind of stuff that was parroted and rehearsed by our government.
Lammy.
Including David Lammy, who made those kind of assertions. But also, I think we also are seeing a massive resurgence in interest in questions of surveillance, right? So partly because we have currently in a public inquiry in which the undercover police operations, the Special Demonstration Squad, which spied on the Stephen Lawrence family and many other black families in the 1970s and 80s and 1990s, are currently being scrutinised in a public forum, but also because these kind of operations are ending now, and they're partly ending because of resistance, but they're partly ending because the nature of surveillance is changing, right? They don't need to deploy physical officers into our homes and our community spaces and our protests, because they can deploy officers into our digital communication devices. And I think being able to manage this is going to be a new challenge, both certainly for activists, but I think for everyone.
And just that point that you said on everyone, I just want to go back to a conversation that we had with you on this show back in 2020, the summer of 2020, so during the second wave of Black Lives Matter protests. And something that you said really stuck with me, like, policing is bad for everyone. Of course, like, black people are disproportionately policed, but what the pandemic shows us, or what the lockdown shows us, is that it is a multi-class, multi-ethnic issue that should be at the attention of everyone. Black resistance, or the black radical tradition, is a threat to the state because it takes everyone with them. Like, we're fighting for everyone. And I think that the connection between surveillance and policing. And I just think we were talking kind of anecdotally about, like, white people getting pissed off about being stopped on their country walks during lockdown. It's like, no, this is what policing is. So understand what it is. And I think that was such a crucial moment for political education on policing, which I think people did their best, but to capture that. But would we be able to recapture that kind of politics to get people to understand that it's a multi-class, multi-ethnic issue? I
think one of the key issues that's going to break down a lot of these kinds of barriers is the climate crisis.
Yeah.
I think it becomes more pronounced. We will soon realise, and we are already realising, right? Rishi Sunak announced just this week that he will abandon green policies if they adversely affect consumers, right? But of course, what he really means is if they adversely adversely affect shareholders, who then raise prices so their dividends don't go down, and then it hits consumers in the pocket, right? So that people are going to realise that this government is going to literally take down the earth, right? Right? They're going to. It's not.
So it's not funny, but
they're going to take down. Then they are unwilling to. They are willing to sacrifice the earth for short-term gains of profit and power. And I think that is going to cut across many of the divisions that we currently see. And I think it has to cut across them if we're going to survive in any meaningful way as a species.
Thank you for that. So true. So one of the other parts of the book, and I know like your politics in general, is about drawing solidarities that are both, international, local, national, all of it. And you talk about Extinction Rebellion, and like you said previously about Just Stop Oil. And one of the things that I feel like is sometimes difficult within kind of anti-racist intellectual thought, but also anti-racist movement building, is how do we deal with, or how do we be in solidarity with groups that aren't centering that within their practice?
We make the road by walking, right?
Go on.
And I've gone to a lot of Extinction Rebellion meetings and events and stuff. Partly because I've been invited, right? They've said, look, we want to think about the global south and what we can learn, we need to think about how we cut across different communities, because this is a global struggle. We need to think about racial capitalism in these kind of ways.
That's
right?
good. XR saying this.
I mean, XR is a broad
Yeah.
church.
No, it's good to put this on the podcast though, because like obviously people
Yes.
are like, oh, what the white people are just doing organized, but it's not that, is it? But how do we sort of disrupt that language and thought around?
I mean, I mean, there are people in XR who are like dyed-in-the-wool third worldists, right? Reading Kwame Nkrumah, and there are people who are dyed-in-the-wool liberal Democrats, right? And many things in between. And I think that's kind of, a broad coalition is kind of necessary given the scale of the crisis that we are currently facing, right? And there is a big debate at the moment as to whether, in order to stop the climate crisis, we have to abolish capitalism. And I'm kind of the thinking that the crisis is too close, right? The crisis is too acute for us to think that we can abolish capitalism before the crisis becomes so pronounced that we're not that our social systems aren't able to function anymore, right? I think this kind of emergency requires broad coalition building, and I think what we have to work for is a coalition that comes in our direction, right? And realizes that, look, all of these institutions that you have put your faith into, that you think are neutral and objective and fair and righteous and just, are the institutions which are responsible for destroying the planet which we all need to live on. And therefore we can think about it in relation to the police that are deployed to disrupt and repress climate activism. We can think about it in relation to the border regime, which is sent to send back and effectively kill people who are fleeing climate disaster and other forms of environmental catastrophe. We can think about it in all of these kinds of ways that the book is focused on when we bring people in through these other kinds of issues such as climate activism, I think.
Definitely. Is there a way of connecting like the climate emergency and crisis and how we organise and resist to that through also thinking about prison abolition? And one of the things, again, like I think it's to do with the way you've written the book, and it was good to know earlier in the episode that you would like send it to various people, because it's very clear, but sometimes the clarity in which you're communicating these ideas and histories of resistance is sometimes like it's hard to read, but that's not a bad thing. But there's a section that I want to read to you. Basically, you're describing prison. The creation of hundreds of criminal offences, surveillance technologies and powers such as injunctions has inevitably led to an extraordinary expansion in the use of prisons. The assumption that prison, locking a human being in a cage for a set period of time, is the best way to solve a social problem such as drug possession, theft or violence has become common sense. It is erroneously assumed, much as it used to be for capital punishment, that the fear of imprisonment deters people from committing crimes, and that actual imprisonment consequently deters them from reoffending. But the continual growth of prisons, with no long-term reduction in violence within low-income communities, indicates they are by no means a deterrent. The levels of recidivism and further weight to the failures of hurted benefit of prisons. People with a history of mental health problems, special educational needs, problematic drug use, trauma, homelessness, precarious legal status, school exclusion, child abuse and domestic violence are grossly overrepresented in prisons. But rather than decriminalising drugs and investing in the social and other services that could address these social problems, the police and prison system is used to problematise the people rather than the issues they face. That really stood out to me because that feels like that is the problem at hand. How do you communicate that? How do you democratise that information to people who are so committed to carceral culture and understandings of right and wrong, good and evil? And it made me also think about, again, like a kind of multi-class politics around abolition, like the descriptions you give around the people that are obviously overrepresented in prison populations are also like within Surrey in their families. Like very often people have lived experience of like addiction, of trauma, of domestic violence. How do we organise around those politics? But also, how is that connected to climate change as well? It's a big one. I know you can do it though.
I was recently thinking about this kind of question, but in relation to war as well as climate change, right? Because I was looking back at old Jeremy Corbyn's speeches.
Oh yeah.
As you do. And, you know, he had these huge, went around the country. We forget, right? He was touring the country and, you know, it was lock off, like everywhere. He was, right? Corbynism was huge, right? Tens of thousands of people all over the country. And he would make relatively similar speeches when he would make speeches about war and people fleeing the climate breakdown, right? And he would say, look, we're told all the time that the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, that, you know, these bombs and these soldiers and this violence is going to help them with their problem with girls not going to school in Afghanistan, or the oppression of women. But of course, that's not what's going to help them. Like, if you really want to help people with education, you need infrastructure, don't you? You need investment in the kinds of social infrastructure that enables people to engage in political participation and social participation and education and what have you, right? You say, look, these places are there are problems with disease or corruption, political corruption, and all these other social problems, right? But of course, we know that the guns and bombs and soldiers and occupations are not going to solve that, right? We know that people need hospitals and roads and cities and lives and green space and all of those kind of things, right? And it's a very kind of common sense argument that is often given by people like Jeremy Corbyn to great effect, right? But I think you can make a very similar kind of argument about the police and prison system, right? It's the same kind of argument is being made, right? Look, we're not going to liberate the people of Iraq and Afghanistan with bombs and guns and soldiers, and we're not going to liberate the people from Britain's working class estates all over the country with cops and prisons and deportations, right? And I think if we think about war and militarism as being a continuum connected to police and prisons, then we can connect the reasons that people are fleeing, or there are issues in places already on the receiving end of climate breakdown, and connect that to the social problems that exist right on our doorsteps, right? And realise that both of them require social investments and social kinds of change, not Fortress Europe, not Fortress Britain, not, you know, stop the small boats. Those aren't the kinds of things which are going to solve this problem in any kind of way, let alone in a humane way.
No, I think that is it, isn't it? That's it. That's the thread. It has to be, because after I read that, I was watching a segment on Channel 4 News talking about Cookenwood youth offenders prison, and how there'd been young people held in solitary confinement for up to 100 days. This is kind of an extension of like the kind of politics that was, well, not the kind of policies that were being enacted during the pandemic as well, like keeping prisoners in solitary confinement. And the segment on Channel 4 News had an ex-prisoner who's a campaigner, basically an abolitionist campaigner, kind of guy from working class background, racialised as white, and then you had the head of not the trade union, but the head of the union for prison officers. And like, it was so interesting hearing them both talk about what was happening, or argue about what was happening, because they kind of both agreed. And he was the kind of campaigner, the abolitionist campaigner, was saying like, these are children, they need like care, they need support, like they need education, they need to be treated with dignity. And then the prison officer was saying, well, we need to protect prison officers. They're experiencing violence. You can give people care if they're not violent. And then the kind of abolitionist guy was like, these are young people. Like, how can you not see them as young people? And it was really interesting seeing how what had happened there was it's like a hierarchy of humanity, and like how we kind of present this publicly is that the way how toxic carceral cultures are is that it enables adults to position children, dehumanize children in that way. And I guess I kind of found it interesting because they were both saying that there's no funding, that no one's supported within this institute, and it's like, okay, so get rid of it then. Do you know? And it was just so interesting seeing that parallel. It's like, okay, this is that. Where's the where's the solidarity there? Where can that be found? But because the prison officer has this kind of a hierarchy of who is deserving of dignity, it sometimes feels impossible, doesn't it?
I mean, I think in order to be a prison officer, right, you have to some extent dehumanize the people that you are locking into a cage on a day-to-day basis. I don't know how else you can really do that. I remember going to a very bad conference called Castle Geographies, and they had some prison officers presenting.
Oh God!
And one of the things they said was, we have to decide, when a prisoner kind of collapses or whatever, if they are, and this is the phrase they used to an academic conference. Are they a faker, or are they a pension taker? And just continued. And as soon as the Q&A came, I put my hand up straight away.
Of course.
And I said, so you use this interesting phrase, faker or pension taker. Could you explain what that means, right? And of course it means that, if they're not faking it, then they will die, and then you will get fired and you won't get your pension, right? And so this is, I thought like this illustrated in a really, violent way the disposability, right, to which these prison staff members, I guess, are institutionalized into thinking, right? This person is either going to, this thing is either going to lead to me losing my pension, or it's nothing to worry about, right? And that's all it comes down to. So I think that there is a problem. I think there is a necessity to dehumanize people, right? And we see this with the military and the police and other institutions of power, right? It's part of the kind of psychosocial world of these kinds of institutions. But I think it's also interesting and important for us to think about this in the context of children and young people, right? And Ruth Wilson Gilmore has this brilliant essay called The Problem of Innocence, right? Where she talks about how we have to be careful about identifying, these trans people shouldn't be in this prison, or these people have mental health problems, they shouldn't be in prison. These people have experienced domestic violence, they shouldn't be in prison. They've only done non-violent drug offences, they shouldn't be in prison. Until we eventually, the kind of logic is that eventually we will find the perfect subject who should be in prison.
Yeah.
Right.
I hear you.
And it's because it's very easy to do, and I appreciate it's a strategic thing, right? That can make relatively short-term gains and get fewer people in prison. But I think she makes a really, I think, poignant warning there to us, right? And she sees it happening quite a lot. And so, I want to always be really careful about thinking about advocating for specific type of imprisoned people, including young people, of course, but not allow that to negate the necessity for care that all people need, whether they're incarcerated or not.
Yeah, you're right. And that's such an important point, and thank you for saying that, because it reminds me as well of the kind of politics around, or how we talk about prevent. So you'll get some people now that are saying, well, prevent is looking at working class white people that are influenced by Andrew Tate and the far right. Isn't that a good thing? And it's no, none of it's good. So thank you for bringing that to this conversation, because you can where I can sometimes get enticed by a hearts and minds politics, how do you convince people, how do you, and sometimes I'll kind of push vulnerability as a way to kind of get people to understand, but actually there will be a dead end there. Yeah,
and I think we just have to. We're none of us are political purists, and we have to be pragmatic. And there's a certain situation that we can exploit to maybe gain safety for some people when they're in immediate danger. But I think this is also there's also an important warning there in her work that I just wanted to comment on.
No, it's brilliant. It's really brilliant. Okay, Adam, threads of hope, please. The end of the episode. Give me some hope.
Threads of hope.
I think that book is actually very hopeful.
I wanted to write something hopeful.
Yeah.
And I am. I started out as a youth worker before I got into research
in Nottingham.
Formally in Nottingham, indeed, in Radford, and then down in London as well. It's that younger generation that often gives me hope, right? I've been, we're running a a summer school in Hackney, and I'm looking forward to working with a lot of young people there. A lot of my friends are still youth workers doing fantastic stuff. And, when I went out on the streets in 2020 to write the final few pages of the book before I sent it off to the publishers, right, it was the young people who were out, right? It was the young people who were leading it and organising it and coming with the energy and coming with those post-colonial critiques, those socialist critiques, those radical abolitionist demands, right? And I think while there is so much we need to learn from history, and we've covered a lot of history today, I think the future relies on us bolstering the hopeful energy of a younger generation that might not be aware of all of those histories, but are aware of the necessity and the urgency of creating a better future.
That's brilliant. One more. Can I have a hopeful thread on getting rid of capitalism?
Yeah, sure. So I think we're seeing a resurgence of union organising in this country. I remember doing a workshop with young people in an organisation called Shake years ago when I first started my PhD. And someone came in to do a workshop on Thatcherism and talks about how she crushed the unions and gave a whole kind of really great, vivid story of this crushing of, the unions and the destruction of the welfare state. And then after about 40 minutes, he said, any questions? And one of the young people put up his hand and said, what's a trade union? And you know what? Back in 2011, 2012, I felt like that was a fairly normal question. They didn't seem to really be on the radar. I don't know if a young person would ask that question today.
Yeah.
Especially if they've got a bus or
a train
or gone to a hospital or been to school, right? Strikes are happening, right? There is a resurgence in union organising and union action. And it's not just in Britain, obviously. I mean, partly because Britain is usually lagging behind much of the rest of the world in that regard, right? And I think, union organising and workers coming together and demanding better pay and conditions is the crucial first step towards a broader kind of movement which seeks to transform our social and political and economic system, right? And that's what we need. And I think, crucially as well, let's not forget that abolitionism is just another way of saying communism, right?
Come on.
Right? We know that.
Come on.
Ruth Wilson Gilmore herself says, look, we don't say communism anymore because, the bad PR and all that. But that's what abolitionism is, right? It's about changing everything. But the reason we talk about abolitionism rather than, global communist revolution is because we're not living in the 70s and 60s anymore, right? There's no Cold War raging. There's no third world struggles in Angola and Algeria and Grenada and Trinidad and Nicaragua and the Philippines in the way that there once was. And we have to articulate our revolutionary politics through what we're confronting today. And what we're confronting today is not the Cold War, not an attempt at a third world rising. It's the prison state. And so our revolutionary visions and our revolutionary politics are being articulated through abolitionism. And that is the politics that's on the lips of many of our radical younger activists. And I think it's that, and that's certainly what gives me hope for an end, not just to police and prisons, but to capitalism as well.
Adam Elliot-Cooper, mic drop. My God, your mic drop. Surviving Society mic drop for you. That was amazing.
Thank you so much for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on, Adam. We'll see you next week.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe to host or produce a series of Surviving Society.
Get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.